Thanks in part to a surge in early voting, the turnout for the September primary election in Massachusetts was the highest in years. The last primary with a higher turnout percentage here in Boston was in 2006, but the number of votes cast this year was higher by more than 50%. Meanwhile, there's more help for people who want to use early voting, including mail-in ballots in the final election. To bring us up to date is our guest from Common Cause, Massachusetts, the Assistant Director, Kristina Mensik. Thank you very much for being with us, Kristina.
Thanks so much for having me, Chris.
Kristina, I know before the primary, a lot of us were worried about voters staying home, trying to avoid infections, but how good was the turnout this year, especially with all these mail-in ballots?
Sure. So we saw record turnout this year, which I know many of us who worked on passing the legislation for this fall were not surprised that there was record turnout. I think the extent of it definitely surprised us. We saw 4 times as many people participate in this year's primary as did in the primary in 2016. That was 1.7 million voters who were able to make their voice heard. I think that it's particularly significant because it happened during the pandemic. I think it's a clear testament to the fact that vote by mail works, that when you reduce barriers to political participation, more people turn out and make their voice heard in our democracy.
When I was voting by mail, I think maybe the hardest part, and I'm not saying this is really hard, was just sort of making sure I got to the post office to make sure it got to where it had to go on time. Was that an issue for other people?
Definitely. Between delays in the mail, delays with sending the mail ballot applications, and attacks on the USPS, there were a lot of voters who were concerned that their mail ballot would not be counted. We believe that going into November, we have one advantage in particular, which is that the deadline for ballots to be received is 8 p.m. or excuse me, ballots just need to be mailed by 8 p.m. on election day or delivered to secure drop boxes by 8 p.m. And then election officials have until 5 p.m. on the following Friday to process those ballots. That said, there are steps that voters absolutely should take in order to ensure that their voice is heard in our election. I think requesting mail ballots as early as possible is one important first step. Returning them as early as possible, and ideally making use of secure drop boxes. There's no such thing as a one-stop shop fix to elections during a pandemic, but I think that the secure drop boxes are a really important step. They provide voters the assurance that their mail ballot will be counted, and they also allow, of course, for the social distancing that many need to stay safe right now.
According to research from Mass Inc., I think 51% of the voting in Boston was early, and the figure was much higher in some of the more affluent communities. Does this mean that some other voters are being left behind in a way?
Yeah, I think that's a really important survey. Early voting in the past has expanded access or driven up participation in wealthier, whiter communities. It's no surprise that the same thing would happen this year. The the legislation passed this fall has a couple of additional provisions that I think will expand access and participation this November for our low-income communities, our communities of color, student populations, and the elderly. One is the online ballot request portal that just went live this week. Folks can now, rather than waiting for an application to come in the mail or filling out a paper application, just go and do so online. The second advantage that we have is a shortened registration deadline. Our registration barrier disproportionately impacts communities of color, low-income communities, and we have been fighting for years to bring same-day registration to Massachusetts, but the 10-day registration window rather than 20 is a solid first step. What's more, this year we technically have same-day registration between October 17th and October 24th. So if a voter goes to their town hall to participate in early voting on those days, they can also register that day or update their registration. But the bottom line is, in all of our advocacy going into this fall and going forward, we absolutely have to keep in mind the disproportionate impact that different barriers put in place for our communities who have long been underrepresented and under-resourced. And we need to prioritize reforms that particularly bolster access to the ballot for them.
I think the easiest part about mail-in voting for me was getting an application sent to my home in the mail. Now, there are voters who change their address more often, and couldn't that also mean a kind of imbalance that has to be addressed?
Absolutely. That's why the online portal is so important. We know that the first mailing of applications went out to folks where they were registered as of July 15th. That doesn't help folks who move. It doesn't help folks who are new to the state or who are registering for the first time. The advantage of this online portal is that a voter can go online through the portal. They're encouraged to, or they have to check their registration status or register or update their registration before they go to cast a ballot.
Okay. Now, what about what happens after this election year? Because as you mentioned, this was all this early voting innovation was enabled by a bill at the State House. It's going to expire. What would you like to see beyond this year?
Sure. So I'll add that a coalition of organizations across the state are working on ballot access for eligible voters who are incarcerated. I think that next session we need legislation that streamlines that process and ensures that nobody faces the system of de facto disenfranchisement that currently exists in Massachusetts. In addition, we absolutely need to make permanent many of the reforms that were included in our fall legislation. There's no way that after over 1 million people participated in mail voting that you can take that back. So of course we need to expand mail voting. We need to expand early voting. I think next session has to be when we bring same-day registration to Massachusetts. And we have a number of other legislative priorities, but I think that going into the next session, our two should be making permanent those reforms that work well this fall. And second, looking to reforms that will expand and secure ballot access for our communities of color, our low-income communities, and all of those who are historically, sometimes systemically disenfranchised.
Now, I know a lot of our viewers are focused on the presidential election, but the upcoming final election is going to have a very important vote about the voting process. Can you say a little bit about that?
Sure. So ranked choice voting is on the ballot in Massachusetts this year, which I think is really exciting. We're the second state to have the option of bringing ranked choice voting to Massachusetts. And to understand what ranked choice voting would do for our elections, I don't think we need to look any further than the 4th congressional district race that happened. What ranked choice voting does is it allows voters to rank their candidates rather than just picking one. This eliminates a lot of negative campaigning. It allows for a more accurate representation of voters' preferences, and it ensures that in an instance where voters are split, a good example is in a race with 5 candidates and 4 candidates who prioritize the environment. Environmental voters may be split among those 4, and as a result, the one outlier who is not would be the one who wins. I think that what we've seen in cities that use ranked choice voting is more participatory elections, races where candidates focus on issues and policies rather than on attacking each other. And I hope that we bring it to Massachusetts as well.
I certainly get the argument about candidates having to broaden their appeal or maybe moderate their appeal, but there are critics of this. Some of them say it's too complex. It turns off voters who are maybe not as steeped in political process. What about that?
I think I just have to say I disagree. In our daily lives, we rank all kinds of things and are used to understanding that rather than just having, one person you like or one who you don't, you may have an order of preferences. So from folks who I've talked to, I haven't found that to be the case. I also think that with any reform, there does come some adjustment. So there may be a transition period where voters need to get themselves, and we would certainly need robust public education to explain this process to voters. But I think that the bottom line is it isn't that complicated. And once voters begin to use it, they really like it and they participate more.
Well, finally, we should be absolutely clear and remind people one more time about the deadlines for early voting and how they can apply for mail-in ballots if they haven't had that done already for them.
Sure. So on our coalition's website, safeelectionsma.org/vote by mail, you can register to vote, request your mail ballot, track your ballot, and locate your municipality's secure drop box. I think the most important thing for voters at this moment is that they make their plan to vote, that they check their registration, and if they do plan to vote by mail, or even if they just want that as an option, that they request their mail ballot online.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to walk us through that.
Sure thing. Thank you.
That was Kristina Mensik from Common Cause, Massachusetts. We'll have more news in just a moment.